Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andres Carrasquillo, and I am a Community Engagement Specialist at SCAG. Thank you for joining our 5th session in SCAG Go Humans Traffic Safety Peer Exchange Series. I'll be facilitating today's session along with Laura Richards, one of our consultant supports on this project. At this time, we encourage you to type your name, pronouns, and organization in the chat feature. My pronouns are he, him, since I'm doing my introduction verbally. These introductions in the chat will let you know who's in the room, and it will help us to ensure that the chat feature is functioning for you. I can move on to the next slide, please. For our meeting logistics, this peer exchange is anticipated to run for an hour and a half. Right now, all participant lines should be muted. At the end of all presentations, there will be a Q&A. But if you have a question at any point, feel free to type it into the chat box. If you think of something later, you can reach out to Courtney Aguirre using the email on your screen, or to myself, or to any of the presenters. And all presentations will be emailed to those who are registered to participate in today's meeting. Move on to the next slide, please. As staff at SCAG, I acknowledge that we are on land of the Chumash, Tongva, and Kizh. As we acknowledge we are on the original lands of the Chumash, Tongva, and Kizh peoples, and how deeply the field of urban planning continues to engage with land, we offer this acknowledgement as a first step to more conversations and actions that will support Indigenous communities in thriving. Next slide, please. Today's peer exchange will include presentations focused on addressing equity in the built environment. We will hear about race, place, and space, ensuring roadways promote safe transportation access, and addressing the factors that increase traffic crash rates in underserved communities. To wrap up after presentations and Q&A, we will have breakout sessions that will last approximately 15 minutes, where you can chat more directly with today's speakers as well as with each other. And next slide, please. And to start things off and frame this conversation, I'd like to share a quick update on our region's existing conditions and our Go Human program. Next slide, please. Now, as many of you are aware, our region is home to roughly 19 million people, about half the entire state's population, and about 13 million licensed drivers. Each year, on average, nearly 1,500 people die, 5,500 people are seriously injured, and 124,000 people sustain injuries in traffic collisions in our region. And we anticipate, as the region emerges from the pandemic, the rates of fatalities and serious injuries may continue to rise, particularly if people shift away from using public transit or shared vehicles. Collisions are occurring in every single community in the region, from Thousand Oaks in Ventura to El Centro and Imperial. However, the vast majority, more than 70% of fatal and serious injury collisions are occurring in urban areas, and almost 70% occur on local roads. Across the region, about a quarter of collisions are the result of unsafe speed. And this is important to note, as the survivability in a collision decreases significantly with increases in speed. Next slide, please. This information and more is detailed as well as detailed analysis is included in our Regional Transportation Safety Existing Conditions Report, which we'll provide a link to in the chat. We just completed an update of this report earlier this year. It provides a region-wide and county-level breakdown. In our efforts to eliminate serious injuries and fatalities across the region, we engage in a variety of efforts, including these traffic safety peer exchanges, and the Go Human campaign. Next slide, please. The Go Human campaign is SCAG's active transportation safety and encouragement campaign. SCAG launched this in 2015 to reduce traffic collisions and encourage people to walk and bike more. And since then, Go Human activities have expanded the conversation around vehicular violence into a suite of programs that broadly fall within 3 categories. The first is our co-branded safety messaging materials, which can be requested right now on the Go Human website at no cost. These materials come in the form of lawn signs, banners, bus shelter ads, as well as digital advertisements that you can deploy to support your own safety campaign messaging. The second area are our temporary safety demonstrations and programming. Go Human provides a kit of parts at no costs, which is a set of modular pieces that can be assembled to demonstrate different street design treatments like parklets, bulb outs, and crosswalks. And finally, Go Human offers safety workshops, webinars, and technical assistance to provide additional education on safety best practices and to facilitate knowledge exchange, such as this series here. In addition, we are implementing a new community safety ambassadors program, which is a participatory planning and leadership development series taking place in the counties of Imperial, San Bernardino, and Ventura. Next slide, please. These traffic safety peer exchanges are a part of Go Human's ongoing efforts to increase traffic safety. Please visit our website at gohumansocal.org to register for more traffic safety peer exchanges and to learn more about our programs. You can keep up with our updates by signing up for our quarterly newsletter and by following us at Go Human SoCal on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And so we encourage you all to, if you haven't already, to sign up for the additional traffic safety peer exchanges, which continue next month. And with that, I will pass to Laura to run a poll.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andreas. I'm Laura Richards with Cambridge Systematics. I'm she, her. And to kick things off, we wanted to get a sense of where your organizations are with respect to integrating equity into the built environment. So we had just a couple of different polls here, and I think folks will be queuing them up. Is that right? Here we go. All right. So our first poll here, and these are all just yes or no, but we wanted to know, has your organization defined equity? So have you already kind of as an organization identified, what does equity mean to you? It could be at this point, either internal or external, whether that's equity within internally what you're working on and doing, or equity that you would, a definition that you would integrate into your projects and programs. Either one, if it's yes, please select that. And we have over half of you at yes on that right now. I'll go ahead and read through the remainder of the polls because I think you can respond to all of them at the same time. But our next question was, does your community have an equity-focused process for prioritizing investments? So are you incorporating equity into your prioritization decisions in any way? And we will dive deeper into each of these topics in our breakout sessions later. So this will be a lot of great information for us to get started with. And our last question here is, does your community monitor and track the outcomes of equity-focused prioritization or projects to determine if the equity safety objectives are met? So we are actually looking like over half of the folks are yes on all of these. So we've got, of everyone that's responded, 77% of you have defined equity in your organization. We have 62% that have an equity-focused process for prioritizing investment. And we have just over 50% of you all who have actually monitored the outcomes of that integration of equity into the built environment. So That is great information for us to get started with. Thank you. And now we would like to welcome Naomi Dormer. She is the Director of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at Nelson Nygaard. She's a nationally recognized transportation equity and mobility justice strategist with expertise facilitating and implementing systems change inside of organizations, agencies, and institutions for fair and just community outcomes. She currently serves as the first director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Nelson Nygaard, where she's developed an internal training curriculum and applies a racial equity approach to the projects with and for clients. And prior to joining Nelson Nygaard, Naomi served as the first citywide transportation equity program manager at the City of Seattle Department of Transportation. So just a quick reminder before I hand this off to Naomi that we will be having one Q&A at the end of the 3 presentations. But if you have questions throughout the presentations, please feel free to type them in the chat and we will go through those again in the Q&A at the end. So thank you and welcome, Naomi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Naomi, as has already been mentioned. And yeah, I'm just going to dive into the presentation and our discussion today by really discussing the relationship between race, space, and place. It is really important framing as we do our work. And it's we've developed an approach at Nelson Nygaard and have applied this in a lot of the work that we do in the communities that we work in. So I'm going to share a little bit about that today. So a little about Nelson Nygaard, for those of you who don't know, just do a real quick overview. If you can go to the next slide, please. Are you all able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, so the presentation is just going to consist of the following. I'll do an overview of Nelson Nygaard, talk a little bit about race, space, and place, and then also talk about the approach that we take. Next slide, please. So Nelson Nygaard is a firm. We are a private consulting firm. We work in a number of communities and we have offices across the country. We have about 130 people working for us, formerly woman-owned, but have grown to not be a minority business anymore, but we started out that way. And our values are really what guide our work. We are people-driven as well as equity-focused. And so that is both internally and then on the projects and the work that we do. And you know, we really believe in the importance of building supportive relationships with the clients and our partners in the work that we do. Okay, next slide, please. We are a multimodal firm, so we have we work in transportation on a variety of projects and sectors. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. I think one more slide. And so we're going to just, I'm going to couch our conversation a little bit with some framing. Normally I would do a much deeper dive on this, but I think it's really important because often I get asked the question, well, why start with race? And it isn't at the exclusion of other communities that are experiencing, you know, disproportionate outcomes as it relates to transportation and mobility and upward mobility. However, we do know that if we take this sort of targeted approach of looking at race and how racism has really affected both historically as well as currently our thinking, our systems, then we know that we'll be able to unearth and uncover where some of the disparities are highest. And by doing that, we're able to then target solutions to really be, you know, ensuring that those with the greatest needs are being addressed. And so we really take an approach where we're working at the institutional level often. And there is this sort of really important lens that we do need to take, however, that there are 4 levels by which both race and racism really work and kind of maintain their structural place, right, in decision-making and processes. And so we know that race and racism operate at the individual level. So internally, you know, we know that they also operate at and influence decision at the interpersonal level. So amongst colleagues, community members, family members even, and then it also takes place at the institutional level. And this is important because this is where most of us are working. And it's important to remember that institutions are comprised of colleagues, of communities, and also of individuals. And then at the higher level, right, like within transportation, that is one system. But when you then overlay transportation and housing and education and a number of different other systems, that's where you get into structural racism and where you get into structural barriers as well. And so all of the other levels that we're operating at are inside of these, right, systems and structures. And so I'd like to start here because it's really important that we recognize this as we're really thinking about the work that we do, and we are making it an everyday effort because these forces and these this is at play at such a sort of integral level. It is the water that we're in. And so if we think of it that way, then, you know, I think it just impresses upon us the importance of working to undo the effects of race and specifically racism in our systems. So next slide, please. Now, I know many of us have really, like, we're aware of what redlining is, the practice of, you know, having banking institutions essentially indicate which neighborhoods were desirable, which were not, and that really then led to where resources and where investments went and where they did not, and who lived where and who didn't, and it was all based on race. So I know that we're aware of this practice, and it's really important that we understand that it was not the only practice, that there were, again, a number of systemic policies and programs that really led to, you know, one of these outcomes being redlining, but many, many more. And the outcome has been, you know, that we've really got a number of communities that are racially segregated, covenants, redlining, blockbusting occurred, which was really where you went into an area and, you know, really got people to leave their community at a very, like, low or depreciated value. So all of this has really concentrated communities of color, people with disabilities, and a variety of other barriers, providing them with less mobility and less upward economic mobility and access to opportunity, higher pollution rates, poor public outcomes, higher crash injury fatalities, higher enforcement rates, and so on and so forth. So it's important to note that redlining, while it is really, it's talked about perhaps the most, it really was just one of these sort of outcomes or symptoms, essentially, of a variety of other systemic policies that took effect. And so that is sort of the backdrop. Next slide, please. So then we have all of this, we know all of this history. What we're actually talking about is equity and racial equity as it relates to space. So when we look at the history and even the resulting outcomes that we're really working to undo today, what we want to do is think about what is the aspiration that we have. And that is, right, in terms of racial equity and the approach that we at Nelson Negar take, it's ensuring that everyone has what they need to be successful and thrive by taking race and the impacts of racism into account and systemically removing those barriers. So making sure that the folks that are experiencing these barriers are centered and that they're actually helping to make the decisions, right, that are best for themselves and their lives. So that is part of the removing barriers. Next slide, please. And I'm going to wrap up here really quickly to just talk about the approach that we take. Next slide. So at Nelson Nygaard, we, and many of you may have seen a similar framework or approach. It's been slightly adapted so that we could use it for planning processes and policy and things of that nature. But the Government Alliance for Race and Equity is a great resource, works with a lot of jurisdictions, and they have a framework. We've adapted this slightly to work with sort of the planning processes. So at the high level, ultimately what we want to do is, again, set our desired vision for equity within mobility and transportation. Then we want to analyze the historical and current conditions, which we often start with current conditions in planning, but it's important to understand the historical context that led to the current conditions. And then engaging impacted communities, so those who have been most affected. Then with the communities that we are engaged with, developing the strategies, the equity strategies and the scenarios that we can then either test, develop, and or implement. Then go into the implementation, iteration, benchmarking the progress, monitoring the progress, and finally establishing a transparent feedback loop. So we've used this framework in a variety of projects. And to the right, you see just one of the sort of diagrams that we've used to describe this. This was part of an emerging mobility pilot that we've been working with the city of San Jose was doing. And the last two slides I have are really just to share some ways that we've applied it to data analytics. So if you just go to the next slide, we have applied this framework and approach to our data analytics. So really looking, again, at who's most reliant, at least in this case on transportation, because we were doing some transit analysis, and coming up with like an index, a propensity index. So looking at whose vehicle, who owns vehicles at a lower rate, again, disaggregating by race as well as income, and really using this to identify where is there a great demand for transit and transit service, overlaying this with other information. So next slide. Overlaying this with centers where people not only live, but where they may need to go and things that they may want to access. So really looking at, you know, what is it that they have access to from, in this case, it was jobs. We looked at this in the city of Philadelphia. So with that, I'm gonna end here. Here I've gone a little over, but I'm looking forward to the discussion, and the next couple presentations will go into more examples of cities that are doing work in this area. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Naomi. And again, just a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat as we're going along. I know we're not breaking for a Q&A right now, but we will have one at the end. But now I wanted to welcome Josie Ahrens, a transportation planner for Oakland DOT, Department of Transportation. She has a great deal of experience in placement of roadways and highways and prioritizing investments equitably. She grew up in a union family and developed a strong sense of justice and a belief in collective action from a young age as a result. And she brings that perspective into all of her work, including as a transportation planner at Oakland DOT in the paving and sidewalks program. So she's passionate about furthering mobility, justice, and making cities more equitable places to live, work, and travel. So welcome, Josie.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. Hi, all. I'm Josie Ahrens, transportation planner, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to share today about our Oakland 2019 three-year paving plan. Next slide, please. So I'll just give you a quick overview for the current plan that we're in. It's going by fiscal year, so we actually are finishing up our second year tomorrow, or I guess Thursday. And then we'll have one more year. But this plan, we wanted to do demonstrate quick action within 3 years. We're going to be delivering $100 million in paving construction, which is tripling our previous average annual spending. And we're also prioritizing local streets. So we're putting 75 million of that 100 million towards local streets to improve neighborhood quality of life. Next slide. So I just wanted to start it off with some quick definitions. So we're on the same page. Folks probably know this, but pavement condition index is a grade that describes the quality and condition of a street, and it runs from 0 to 100. I like to say that 100 is a brand new street, 0 is basically gravel, and 50 is in between. We also use this term underserved populations, and that is populations that have experienced historic or current disparities. And for this plan, we define that as people of color, low-income households, people with disabilities, households experiencing severe rent burdens, people with limited English proficiency, and youth/seniors. And I do want to make a note on this one. We used the term underserved populations when we were developing this plan in late 2018. But since that time, the Department of Transportation in Oakland has actually shifted our framing to calling previously underserved populations to priority populations, because we want to be making an active decision, a proactive policy decision to be prioritizing neighborhoods and populations that have been disinvested from. So I left this here because this is an older term, but I also wanted to do a plug for our new term. And then equity, this is a definition that comes from our citywide Department of Race and Equity. So they define it as equity as a goal. It means that your identity has no detrimental effect on opportunities and outcomes. And in order to achieve equity, we as the city government needs to prioritize the needs of underserved populations or priority populations. Next slide. So here's a map of Oakland overall. I just wanted to share how we talk about different parts of Oakland. So we use planning areas. They're larger than neighborhoods, but smaller than our council districts. And there's 9 planning areas in Oakland. And for reference, Oakland has about 435,000 people and is 78 square miles. So a lot smaller than the city of Los Angeles and other cities in SCAG's jurisdiction. Next slide. So this is a high-level overview about how we distributed our resources for the paving plan. So like I said, we have $100 million to start with. This is down at the bottom. The x-axis is showing our 9 different planning areas. The dark blue bar is showing the share of local streets that are in poor condition. So that was streets with a PCI under 50. And then the lighter blue bar is the share of underserved populations or priority populations. Next slide, please. And so basically at a very high level, the way that we divided up our funding for our local streets was just taking those 2 and averaging them. So you'll see that Central East Oakland received 24% of our funding, and then across you'll see that that's how we decided to distribute those $100 million across the city. Next slide. And so we do have a process for prioritizing our major streets, but because $75 million is going towards our local streets, I wanted to dive into a little bit more how we're prioritizing local streets. So this orange box you'll see talks about the overall prioritization. So across the planning areas, we did that by our equity metric, which was that demographic piece, and then the street condition. But then within planning areas, we selected streets in poor conditions near schools. So that was a PCI under 50. And then After we got all the ones around schools, then we selected streets in poor condition until we basically ran out of money. And our goal is to get local streets from an overall average of 46 PCI up to 50. Next slide. So we had this great idea, we had this great plan, but how is it going? How is implementation going? So to date, we've paved 22 miles in the central East Oakland planning area, which is a part of town that has been disinvested from and has the highest share of our priority neighborhoods and our priority populations. This chart is showing the overall number of miles that we paved in Oakland. And last year, our first year, we paved 32 miles, and this year we're about to hit 41, maybe 42. So we're exceeding the number of miles we've paved in the past and are actually exceeding the goals that we've set for the first 2 years. Next slide. So I'll go over this really quickly, but in year one, we got a lot accomplished. We see our paving as a way to deliver complete streets initiatives. So we install new curb ramps, high visibility crosswalks. We also facilitate sidewalk repairs through our paving program. In year one, we added 8 miles of new bikeways and almost 5 miles of paving around schools. Next slide. So this is year two. Like I said, that's wrapping up in a few days with the fiscal year. I'll have more metrics to report on soon, but we have surpassed our goal of paving 40 miles this year. And these are 2 pictures of sections of Telegraph, if you're familiar, that we've just updated. Next slide. That's it. So thank you so much. Happy to answer any questions and look forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Josie. And again, if you have questions, please feel free to just go ahead and type them in the chat, and we will get to all of those after our next presentation when we have the Q&A for everyone. So now I wanted to welcome Lauren Bollard, who is the supervising transportation planner for the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. She will share her experience in addressing factors that increase crash rates in underserved communities. Welcome, Lauren, and I think we're still just pulling up that presentation quickly.
Great, thank you. Okay, thanks so much. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the intersection of our Vision Zero program and our equity related efforts in the city of Los Angeles, particularly the Department of Transportation. So Vision Zero is our city's goal to eliminate traffic fatalities. The goal was adopted back in 2015 through an executive directive from Mayor Garcetti. Our approach to achieving Vision Zero is really just to dedicate our resources where there's the greatest need for safety improvements, with a focus on our most vulnerable populations. So next slide, please. So in LA, as in many cities, we see our most vulnerable communities also bearing a disproportionate share of the traffic crashes that kill and severely injure people. And we can use data to reveal this by overlaying our high injury network with the top quintile of the Los Angeles Community Health and Equity Index. The high injury network is a network of LA streets that represents just 6% of our streets, which is 500 miles still, but where nearly 2/3 of the death and severe injury crashes involving people walking and biking are taking place. And the Community Health and Equity Index is a composite measure of demographics, socioeconomic, land use, health, transportation, and other factors that yields a community score on a scale of 0 to 100. Lower values mean better community health outcomes. The areas with the highest score are in blue on this map, these different shades of blue, and they represent the top quintile, the top 80 to 100% of community scores. And when we overlay the high injury network with this top quintile area, 49% of the high injury network is located in just 20% of these communities. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, due to LA's size, a high injury network that is even 6% of the streets still amounts to 500 miles. And so the Vision Zero priority corridors are segments of the high injury network that really form the basis of our work plan. LADOT developed the first 40 priority corridors back in 2016 with community input on the factors that should contribute to prioritization. And so we gave each intersection a score, and crashes got additional weights when a death versus a severe injury had occurred, when crashes involved a senior or a child, or when the intersection was in a high needs community. We've since adopted an additional 30 priority corridors using more recent data and a different methodology, which identifies segments that meet a minimum rate of death and severe injury crashes per mile over a 5-year period. The majority of these corridors are still in the top quintile, and the LA City Council has directed us to prioritize these segments for investment. Next slide, please. Oh, wait, that's okay. Go ahead, next slide. So as a team, nearly all of our active corridor projects are in those top quintile areas, with the overwhelming majority being in South LA. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those projects, being Avalon, Boulevard, and Broadway. In 2020, our team implemented 2 major safety projects. These streets were identified as part of that first batch of 40 priority corridor projects. Due to their high rates of crashes involving people walking and biking. So 149 people were killed or severely injured between 2009 and 2017. And of these people, 44% were walking or riding a bike. And on Broadway, 34 people were killed or severely injured between 2009 and 2018. And 59% of these people were walking or riding a bike. On both projects, the city redesigned the street to slow speeds, reduced the number of lanes that pedestrians need to cross, and carved out dedicated bike lanes. Next slide, please. So at 6.2 miles, the Avalon Boulevard project is the longest reconfiguration project in LADOT history. The project converted Avalon from 2 lanes in each direction with a center turn lane to 1 lane in each direction, with a center turn lane and bike lanes that alternate depending on the community context between parking protected and standard. And in 2022, the city will break ground on a $20 million plus project that will add concrete, bring sidewalk repair, and additional signal elements to the project. Next slide, please. Nearby on Broadway, we did a similar project, took the street from 3 lanes in each direction down to 2, moved parking away from the curb to make room for a new protected bike lane against the sidewalk. And you can see here in the upper left corner of these images that Broadway is parallel and very near to the 110 freeway. Is often used as an alternate route when the freeway gets backed up. So just another negative externality of having a freeway run through your neighborhood. The city will also break ground on a multi-million-dollar streetscape project here in 2024. So in both of these projects, we're able to implement a near-term version of a future capital-intensive streetscape project, and so able to deliver immediate safety benefits, as well as provide long-term major investments in historically disinvested communities. Next slide, please. Each of these projects depended on extensive community engagement and participation from numerous community partners. On Avalon, LADOT launched an engagement contract through which we partnered with and compensated a variety of community partners, from a local bike club to church leaders. We also hired a street team and hosted 35 days of on-street engagement in May and June of 2019. This engagement included a variety of events to engage different demographics and pockets of the community. These included Friday night bike lights, after church lunch, Mother's Day Zumba, Safe Routes to School outreach, Arts Day, and more. Engagement touchpoints included multiple languages, free food, and other giveaways, and some events had on-site childcare. It's our goal to recreate this for future projects. Next slide, please. On Broadway, things were done a little bit differently. The local council office hired a planning firm to support dozens of community outreach meetings and events in 2017 and 2018. Currently, LADOT is building its first ever dedicated community engagement team, and we're soon going to be releasing a task order solicitation, which is similar to an RFP for community engagement to achieve levels of engagement like we saw in Avalon. Next slide. Our most recent outreach event took place this last Saturday. We hosted Walk the Boulevard on Adams in the West Adams neighborhood. For this event, we partnered with the West Adams Neighborhood Council, a group called Ride and Live in Color, local schools and other local leaders to pop up 10 different stations along Adams with information about the project and other local initiatives. So, please, next slide. The Adams project is the one that's really next up for us in our pipeline, and here's a rendering of what that looks like on the left. We've got a number of other projects, including this one on the right in Reseda, on Reseda Boulevard in the Valley, that will also include a protected bike lane, sidewalk repair, new signal upgrades, and new access ramps. So next slide, please. That's it for me. For more information, you can visit our website, ladotlivablestreets.org, where we have information on these projects and about 100 other projects. And you can also email me for more information or questions. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Lauren and Josie and Naomi. And now we'll check with all of you and see if anybody has any questions. I haven't seen anything come in the chat, but if you did have any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask, or raise your hand if you'd prefer to do it that way, or to type it in the chat. And so just while we're waiting to see if anybody else has any questions, I actually have some that I'll go ahead and ask all of our speakers to answer. And so I wanted to start with checking with each of you how within each of these projects or programs the community is engaged and involved throughout the process. So Lauren, I know you went into this in your last couple of slides, but if each of you could kind of speak with us about how you were engaging and educating and working with the communities.
I can just kind of continue just refining what I spoke about in the last couple of slides. So we initially, when we begin our engagement, do not come with a fully baked project to deliver to the community, but instead sort of come with the data and information that we've gathered and ask the community to contribute their experiences as well. And so that's really the first few months of our engagement process, is really just gathering information and making relationships and connecting with different community organizations and getting to know people and the community. And from there, we will take that information and then come back with some project concepts or different types of interventions that may be useful. And we'll sort of get feedback on that, take that back, and then begin to develop a project and then bring that back out and get additional feedback. So sort of refining the project as it develops. That's sort of high level where it goes. And it usually takes, you know, at least 6 months, if not a year or more.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Josie, if you could share a little bit about the paving project engagement.
Sure, yeah, definitely. So we took sort of a different approach to community engagement for this paving plan. Really recognizing that for a long time, priority populations or neighborhoods have been the ones that have had the time, money, and political clout to bother their council members. And often this has been very white and very wealthy neighborhoods. And so this plan, with our intention with this, was to use data very heavily to come up with this algorithm that I shared with you earlier, matching PCI data and demographic data. And we really wanted to create a fair and equitable plan that prioritized streets, not depending on someone attending a meeting or calling their council member or writing a petition. So this is why our plan uses citywide data. So I have sort of mixed thoughts about this. Relying so much on data definitely has its downsides as well. Data are not biased, and they carry their own assumptions and their own priorities. But yeah, for this plan, we did go out to a number of different neighborhoods and chat with a number of different people, but it was mostly informing people of the algorithm and of the data and of our intentions. It was not asking people to shape the plan. Because so often in our traditional community engagement efforts, we hear the voices most loudly of people who are white and wealthy. And we really wanted to create a plan that was not prioritizing the squeaky wheel. So that was sort of our approach with this plan. I think that, like I said, data do have limitations, and they don't account for everything. And our spatial data in particular often will tell us where we might want to do investments, but not why things are the way they are or what to do about it necessarily. So yeah, that is sort of has been our approach, is really relying on the data, and that may change in the future, but that's where we were with this plan.
Great, thank you, Josie. And that actually leads into another question, but I wanted to ask Naomi quickly if she could share about some of the engagement, either in various projects or in your experience in Seattle as well.
Yeah, sure. I just want to echo, what others have said. I think in the work that we do to support cities and communities, it very much is, I don't know if people have seen sort of this levels of engagement, and moving from inform into involve and then collaborate and really co-create and empowerment is takes time, but I think that when we see projects and when we are able to work on projects that are in the really collaborate to empower space, it does shift the overall outcome in terms of success, right? And it may not be the kind of success that we measure, but it gives us new metrics for success. And I think it helps us see results in communities that are, again, self-determined and desired. And I think, if we're meeting our goals and the community's goals, and these things can happen together, the more we do that, the better off and the more sustainable and the more effective and the more equitable the projects are. So some examples of that in Seattle at the Department of Transportation, where I was previous to this, managing the Transportation Equity Program, we knew that we were making a lot of investments, voter-approved investments in the transit system, specifically purchasing additional service and making on-street improvements to the right-of-way to really, make sure that the speeds and priorities were granted to transit on our right-of-way and the streets. And so while we were doing this, it was really important that folks had access to not just the service, but that it was affordable as well. And we worked very closely with community to understand, not just by providing free and affordable transportation. Specifically, we piloted with the community affordable housing community, and really learned about some of the other barriers, right, that were in addition to the affordability. Certain safety area, like if their lighting was, not there, or there wasn't seating. And so these are the kinds of things that we were able to then kind of say, apart from affordability, which is really important, and apart from just the access, the speed, reliability, and frequency, it was really important that there was also amenities in the right-of-way. And so we were able to leverage our spot treatments to do some of that and to create safety improvements, crosswalks, things of that nature. So you know, I think this is the kind of effort that improves both the environment, the built environment itself. It improves the perception and the feeling that people have in that environment. And it's also ultimately supporting, right, like our goals of mobility for the city. So that was just one example that I could point to.
Great, thank you. And actually we had a question come in that's related. So curious about reflections on repair beyond infrastructure in terms of repair related to building trust, relationships, and community healing as a result of historic disinvestment. And Naomi, I think you touched a little bit on that, but if you want to add on, and then we can ask Josie and Lauren as well.
Yeah, I think in terms of, right, so the kinds of things that we're measuring, like I often hear from communities that like what would look like success is if they felt that there was accountability, if there was transparency, if there was an ongoing relationship beyond just the scope or timeline of a project. And so, you know, how do you measure that? I think is something that has perplexed engineers and planners for some time. And I think that part of it is kind of, you know, what is the progress, right, that is made on the input and the recommendations that are provided by community, and what is the feedback loop, like, you know, how over time is the relationship growing? Does that partner want to continue to be in relationship and work with the community, with the agency? So not like the widget type of measuring that we typically do in terms of like, you know, miles of bike lanes or vehicle miles reduced, but more of this qualitative, but then, you know, there's ways to quantitatively measure, like if we are actually building trust or building relationship. So I don't know if that helps, but.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And let's just go in reverse order. So Josie, do you want to share with us how you were able to address this in your projects, if so?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, this is a great question, a super important one. I'll share for the paving plan, because it was so much based in metrics and in data. I think for us to build trust is that we really follow up and follow through with what we say we're going to do. And so if we're saying we're going to pave the majority of our miles in parts of East Oakland that haven't seen investment for 60 plus years on their roads, then we need to do it. And we need to communicate about when our crews are coming out, when it's going to be done, if there's any concerns, who to reach, and to actually pick up the phone. I think that's the biggest thing, is the follow-up and the follow-through for our paving. Different sections of OCDOT that deal with bike lanes and mobility and parking have their own sort of standard operating procedures around connecting with community members. And I think a lot of that falls into sort of what Naomi was sharing about building trust, and it's around these projects and actually really listening to folks and co-creating solutions together. The paving plan is a little bit different, but I do hope that in doing what we said we were going to do, we actually build that trust.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Lauren, I saw you unmuted. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think everyone is spot on. And my experience is just the consistency of communication. So I think, for example, in Los Angeles, we have our neighborhood council system, and so many times it's sort of like a box that you check off, that you go to the neighborhood council, like maybe a year before your project, and then like several months before your project. But I've found that actually going like every time, even just to update that, you know, not much has changed, or like the timeline has shifted very slightly. So really like just spending the time on the communication. And of course, that's much easier being remote to tune into those community meetings. But I think just the consistency, you saw that also in our Avalon Boulevard community engagement project. That was 35 days of being actually on the street, whether that was the street team going door to door, or an event in a park, or being at a school. So just that repeated contact and opportunity for conversation, and show of investment of like the personnel and the people who are working on the project, I think goes a long way. Actually just relationship building between the people working in the department and the communities.
Great. All right, thank you. So if we don't have any other questions from anyone, we can actually go ahead and move on to our breakout rooms. So we are going to have everyone in one of 3 different breakout rooms. Ultimately, we wanted to get together in these smaller groups so that we can kind of learn and think about how to implement the intersections of equity in the built environment at a practical level. So how we can, or maybe already are, applying these principles in your communities and jurisdictions. And we have, next slide, please. These questions that we'll go over within each of the breakout rooms. So what did you hear today that made you think incorporating equity into the built environment could work in your region? Or if you already are incorporating equity into the built environment, how could that be built on or improved? And then what are some of the obstacles that you run into with embedding equity into the built environment? So, and have you run into them in your jurisdiction? If you have, and you've been able to kind of move forward, how did you do that? So we just want to get together so we can all kind of discuss all of this in more detail and learn from one another. Everyone will be randomly assigned to one of the 3 groups. Myself, Andreas, and Courtney from SCAG will be in each one, taking notes and kind of facilitating. And after, we'll regroup together and we'll share the ideas that were discussed within each group. So I think we'll all just be broken out now. And one speaker will be in each respective group as well. So we'll be able to kind of pick their brains even more. So we'll all kind of break out into our rooms and then reconvene back here in about 15 minutes. Okay, I think that we have everyone back here. So we wanted to do just a quick breakout group report out before we go on to next steps. So actually, why don't we start with Courtney's group? If you wanted to, or whomever you've identified, just give us a quick briefing of your breakout group discussion.
You know, Amy was taking notes for us, and Amy, I don't know if you have a clear synopsis of our discussion. If not, no, it's okay. And so we had a small breakout discussion among ourselves discussing, you know, if you are an organization, say, that's doing, say, bike advocacy, and you want to, you know, reach out to communities that, and do work in communities that may not be their exact priority, how do you know, broaden the tent and engage and understand what their needs and interests are? And how do you, again, work on that engagement and not, hopefully, you know, find ways to bridge, you know, and connect with people if you're not from the communities too. That's a hardship. So is it partnering with CBOs? Is it broadening your focus of your work? How do you broaden and engage more folks who are, you know, interested in some, you know, similar goals, but not exactly precisely, say, bike advocacy per se. I don't know, Amy, if you want to round it out with some of your notes, or if that was sufficient from what you documented for us.
No, that's super great, Courtney.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. And Andreas, if you want to give us a report out quickly.
Sure. Briefly, our discussion focused a lot on the community engagement component of improving the built environment and doing repair work, both, you know, considering physical environment and also relationship building. The understanding that community engagement takes time and takes effort, and also that requires funding. And sometimes there could be a misunderstanding of how much it costs to do community engagement. But in order to do the kind of really be meaningful with building relationships and gathering feedback and providing education, it's important to have that on the ground experience. I had mentioned from Lauren's presentation that there was a Zumba day organized on Mother's Day, and a lot of the efforts around that Avalon Boulevard project were based on a local understanding of what are the kind of important kind of venues for the local community, and at the same time thinking beyond a poster presentation or an open house, and think about how community engagement can also bring joy or be celebratory of a community. And from there, we also discussed the continued interest in evaluating equity and the impacts of this work too.
Great, thank you. And so in our group, we talked about kind of what were some challenges and how we addressed those in our work related to equity in the built environment. So we talked about how having leadership be behind embedding equity into these projects and programs is really important for advancing it. At times this push to embed equity comes from the bottom up, and it can get great momentum that way, but it is sometimes hard to fully embed it into all projects and programs when you don't have that kind of top-down support, or maybe even a board or a council that has adopted definitions, amendments, and really just a dedication and a clear direction to incorporating equity and addressing equity in all projects and programs. And then we talked a little bit more about that building trust and continuing work with communities just all the time, and not necessarily for a specific project, but also the importance of maintaining trust in that doing what you're saying you want to do, which can be hard sometimes because there's project delays and other things that happen. So communicating all of that and understanding that it can be an up and down process. You can work really hard to build trust, and it could be sort of hurt with a project update or something that happens, and you just have to get back out there and keep working at it. It can be messy, but you just have to keep moving forward and be in it for the long haul. And we actually started to talk a bit about data bias too, but we got sort of pulled out at the end. So it sounds like everybody had great discussions, which is wonderful. And again, thank you all for jumping into these breakout groups with us. And I can actually turn it over to Andreas now to discuss next steps.
Yeah, and Edward, if we can share the slides again, make sure where we are. Fabulous. Okay. So I want to thank everybody for participating in today's SCAG Go Human Traffic Safety Peer Exchange. And also thank you to our presenters for sharing their great work, and for my co-facilitator for helping run this session. As we mentioned on the outset, presentations will be emailed to all registered participants. This and next month we will be, or actually next month, we'll be posting all recordings from all of the sessions on the Go Human website. We'd encourage you to consider participating in another peer exchange, and we'll be holding about one a week through mid-August. Please, we encourage you to share feedback with us through an evaluation survey linked on the presentation here and shared in the chat. All of these links are posted in the chat, and if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me or any of the of the project team. We'd be happy to connect you with more resources or answer any questions. Next slide, please, Edward. This is the schedule of the upcoming peer exchanges. We'll have a short break for the 4th of July holidays, and we'll resume on July 13 for a peer exchange at 1 p.m. So we encourage you to sign up for any of these that are of interest to you. And there's more information on our website. And Edward, if you can move to the next slide, please. Here's the contact information for the project team. Again, feel free to reach out. Thank you all so much again, and we hope that you stay safe and stay healthy.